It's Marcel Dursis, and this is The Next Best. I spoke to Charles Hecker this week. Charles has spent 40 years traveling and working in the Soviet Union and Russia. He speaks fluent Russian, and he just wrote a book called Zero Sum. At first glance, the book is about international business in Russia, and it is, but it is also a lens to look at political and economic developments more generally. We spoke about the chaos of the early 1990s, Western governments pushing their companies to invest in Russia, and the impact that closer engagement with Moscow had on our own societies. I enjoyed the book, I enjoyed talking to Charles, and I hope you enjoy our discussion. Let's go. Hi, Charles. Thank you so much for joining.
Marcel, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here.
You know, it's a wonderful book. I've had a lot of fun reading it, and I want to get stuck right in. Before we get to the more detailed question, can you just set the scene a little bit? What was life like in Russia in the early 1990s? What was it like for ordinary people?
Well, it was a real mixed picture, and some of it was sort of joyful, and some of it was really quite serious and destructive. In the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian economy went into a deep, deep nosedive. Inflation was in triple digits and was absolutely crippling the purchasing power of the ruble. So Russian consumers found that their savings were made worthless almost overnight. And buying food and putting food on the table, even in a city like Moscow, the capital, which is a very wealthy city and had always been very well looked after in the Soviet period, in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, putting dinner on the table in Moscow became quite difficult. Don't forget as well that there was a great collapse in post-Soviet industry in the early 1990s. So unemployment skyrocketed. So economically, it was extremely challenging. And bear in mind also that this set the whole period off in an interesting way, because Russians were being told, well, we're on our way to democracy and we're on our way to capitalism and a market economy. And most Russians at the time were saying, well, look, if this is what democracy is all about, and if this is what a market economy is all about, then I want nothing to do with it. So it was a jittery start with one small silver lining, I might say, and that is that, with the collapse of the one-party system, Russia in the early years, in spite of everything else, saw an absolute explosion of freedom, of creativity, of experimentation. It was a time when Russians who could afford it were able to travel culturally, in the media. There was this fantastic flourishing of creativity that had previously been absolutely strangled and bottled up in the Soviet period. So on the one hand, it was a period of enormous economic hardship, yet culturally and socially, it was an extremely exciting time to be in Russia.
And obviously a lot of Western firms were interested in entering the Russian market. Why was that? Why was Russia so attractive as a potential market for some of these Western firms?
Well, I think this is a question of a number of trends coming together all at the same time. And the first is that the Soviet Union collapsed and the Russian Federation emerged during a time when business was globalizing. And what that meant basically is companies were learning that they could do business in parts of the world that they previously had determined were too far or too risky, too opaque. Companies were expanding all around the world, and the emergence of Russia fit that pattern very comfortably. Russia was the world's largest, or one of the world's largest, emerging markets at the time, and we were being told that emerging markets were investable and that this was a sort of branding of Russia as a place to go. So it happened during globalization, number one. Number two, Western consumer companies were convinced, and they were correctly convinced, in spite of the inflation that we've just discussed, that Russians had billions and billions and billions of rubles collectively stashed under their mattresses, and that they were starved for Western consumer goods. So I think that fed the attraction of going to Russia. The other thing is that governments around the world were telling companies to go. Go invest in Russia. Because there was an underlying assumption that by bringing a market economy to Russia and by investing in Russia, we could help with the transition, that there was a role to play for Western business in bringing capitalism to Russia. We could talk later perhaps about whether that assumption was correct or not, But there was a very strong urging from Western governments to get their companies into Russia.
That's such an interesting point because being German, when I think about the German debate now, a lot of it is about businesses putting pressure on the government to move closer to Russia because they want to keep making money and because they're perhaps not so concerned with politics. But at the beginning, a lot of these governments were actually wanting their companies to go there. And it wasn't just Germans. You know, it was French, it was Brits, it was Americans, right?
That's absolutely right. You know, from the White House and from number 10 Downing Street and from politically prominent addresses all over Western Europe, and including places like Japan as well, we were being told directly by government leaders that Russia was an emerging market economy, it was an emerging democracy, and it needed our help, it needed our money, it needed our support. And, you know, not only was the private sector being encouraged to invest in Russia, but through vehicles like the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, through USAID, as it was back then, through the EU's TASIS program, lots and lots of public money was being spent in Russia as well to try to encourage the transition. So there was, you know, these parallel flows of private money and public money going into Russia, all in the hopes of, you know, in the private sector of making money, and in the public sector of again, integrating Russia into the Western or into the global economy in the hopes that we could turn what was once a formidable enemy, the Soviet Union, into, you know, something more like an economic ally.
It was so interesting reading the book because I got the sense that a lot of these politicians, they genuinely believed it. It's not just a ploy to make money. Obviously, they wanted their companies to make money and they wanted to get market share and they wanted influence in Russia. But it seems that they were genuinely optimistic. They thought that things could get better and that this might actually work.
You're right. I mean, this is one of the critical assumptions that the book discusses. And that is the assumption that you can change a country from the outside, and that you can change a country's political system, you can change its economic system, you can change its sort of political and social attitudes almost, simply by virtue of investing in that company, in that country. And, you know, now with the benefit of hindsight, you know, we can see that there were some significant flaws in that assumption. I mean, maybe up to the point of the annexation of Crimea, and maybe even for a couple of years after that, Western business people were saying that Russia was a relatively easy place. You know, later in this process, Russia was a relatively easy place to do deals. That lawyers and bankers and business people were saying that mostly they were doing deals the way they did them in the West when they were doing business in Russia. But I think what we overlooked, knowingly or unknowingly, I think we overlooked a series of political and economic changes in Russia that began in the Putin administration that really defeated that assumption that by going in and building factories and helping, you know, build Russia as a market economy from the inside and encourage it to become a liberal democracy from the outside, that it would become essentially just like us, just like the West. And when you say it now, you think, how could we ever have thought that? But at the time, a lot of people did.
Before we get to Crimea and the response of the business community to that, or lack thereof in some cases as well, I just wanted to go back to those early 90s. So you've got these Western companies, they arrive in Russia, it's a big adventure. Some of the people don't even speak the language. They just arrive there. It's all exciting. It's all interesting. And it's all very different from home. And people start to make money. But obviously, there are also significant challenges. And some of the ways in which you did business then in Russia was very, very different from doing it at home. So what were some of the challenges that companies faced back then?
Well, a few things. You know, thank you for asking that question. I mean, it wasn't all straightforward and simple and easy. And by the way, you know, I should say that the business model that a lot of companies adapted in the 90s kept a very safe distance between them and Russian reality on the ground. There was a lot of business done remotely without a very significant legal and financial and physical presence in Russia. And that was for a couple of reasons. I mean, Russia in the 1990s remained politically unstable. That was a big challenge. But I think the two primary challenges and the ones that concerned Western investors the most were corruption and criminality. I mean, at the time, I was working for a consultancy whose job was to help businesses invest in Russia and elsewhere in the world safely. And the word safely takes on lots of different meanings and connotations. But two of the primary concerns among businesses in Russia were avoiding corruption and avoiding organized crime. Corruption in Russia, to this day, but back in the 90s, was absolutely rampant. And it was everything from petty corruption in getting things like building permits on the sort of routine, day-to-day level, even getting sort of applying for visas as a foreigner sometimes involved some shady practices. And then it also involved real grand level corruption, which was getting ministerial signatures on big projects and getting approvals and green lights from very senior government officials. And it wasn't just corruption between East and West business. It was also, deep corruption within the Russian economy and how Russian individuals and Russian businesses interacted among themselves and interacted with the Russian government. So paying bribes, being asked to pay bribes, getting involved in kickback schemes or other sort of rigged government tenders, for example, these were enormous obstacles to Western investors. The other thing is that Russia in the 1990s was very deeply criminalized, and it was something you could see on the street. There were cars exploding in Moscow periodically as part of contract killings. You could see the sort of security corteges that Russian business people themselves were using to protect themselves from organized crime and from criminal elements. The very famous sort of Malinovy pijak, people who wore the sort of raspberry-colored blazers, who were built like refrigerators and had crew cuts and flat tops. These were the sort of foot soldiers in organized crime to protect Russian bigwigs as they made their way through the business world. And of course, one of the most high-profile events that really terrified the Western business community was the murder in 1996 of Paul Tatum, who was the American part of the joint venture that ran the Radisson Slavyanskaya Hotel and Business Center. He was murdered just in front of the hotel in, an attack that had all of the hallmarks of a criminal contract killing. Those were, that attack and a couple of other highly prominent ones were extremely rare. And that's important to note. But at the same time, the Russian business environment, short of contract killings, was deeply criminalized. And if you were doing business in cigarettes, if you were doing business in alcohol, if you were doing business in sort of goods that were easily counterfeited, you had a real problem on your hands.
And do you mind telling the story, perhaps, of GM and their involvement in the Russian market and the joint venture that they had and how things kind of went wrong?
Yeah, with pleasure. I mean, I had the great opportunity to speak to a very senior executive from General Motors for the book. Her name is Heidi McCormack, and she was quite senior in GM operations in Moscow. And Heidi and I spoke on a number of occasions, and she was quite candid and told me about the years and years of negotiations that she participated in with executives at Russia's largest automobile manufacturer, AvtoVAZ, and the contours of those negotiations and how the joint venture worked as it got up and running. And this was a joint venture to produce the Chevy Niva, which was basically an updated model of the Soviet Niva, which is kind of a sort of a Jeep or SUV sort of thing that was a very famous Soviet car that as a result of the joint venture had a lot of Chevy input into it and had that Chevrolet brand on the front of the car. So, an enormously high-profile East-West joint venture. And what General Motors discovered, the deeper and deeper it got into the joint venture and as negotiations progressed, were that there was an enormous amount. Well, first of all, they found out that a lot of AvtoVAZ executives had hidden ownership in suppliers to AvtoVAZ. And that was a typical sort of Russian corrupt scheme when, the executives of the company itself are essentially skimming off the transactions with suppliers to the company. But what they also discovered was that the assembly line and the supply chain for the assembly line had an incredibly high level of loss of spare parts. And that, components for the Neva just went missing. They just went walkabouts. They really racked their brains as to why on earth they had this incredible level of loss. And what they discovered was that Avtovaz had built a tunnel under the factory with the assembly line. And what they were doing was they were funneling spare parts from the assembly floor into this tunnel and then out, the back door, as it was, and, back into this corrupt supply chain. And, Heidi and her colleagues wanted to shut that down. And Heidi was advised more than once by security advisors that if she shut down this chain of theft from the factory, that her personal security would be at risk. Well, Heidi lived and worked in Russia for a long time and struck me, I met her in person and we've spoken on the phone. Heidi strikes me as a person who doesn't give up easily. Every year for 2 weeks, as part of routine maintenance, the factory would close in the summer. And what Heidi decided was that at the next window, at the next of those, that 2-week window for routine factory maintenance, they filled the tunnel with cement and covered it over. And that really was the only way physically to stop the loss of spare parts off the factory floor.
Yeah, and I guess, part of this is just human nature. People want to make money. There was an opportunity. They saw it, they took it, and they engaged in corruption. But I wonder to what extent you think this was also about the lived experience of some of these people in the previous system. Because, of course, in Russia for many, many decades, there had always been written rules and then the way that things actually worked. So what influence do you think that had?
Well, you're exactly right. And one of the reasons why the assumptions that we made about Russia and about its ability to adapt to a transparent market economy were flawed was, I think, the epic Soviet hangover that never really went away. And Marcel, you're absolutely right that for the Soviet planned economy to work, which itself was one of the world's most dysfunctional economic systems, for that system to work, there were a set of written rules, as you said, and a set of unwritten rules. And it was the unwritten rules, those workarounds, that were the grease in the Soviet system and that helped make the system work. And I think when the market came to Moscow, to Russia, instead of saying, okay, we will all benefit from this written set of rules that comes with a market economy, we can forget the shortcuts, we can forget the workarounds, we can forget the side dealings of the unwritten rules. So instead of saying, great, let's all level the playing field and play according to the market, I think the Soviet hangover meant that there's this new economic system. Let's work around it. Let's shortcut capitalism. And let's keep these informal rules that we've always used. And instead of shortcutting a 5-year plan, we'll shortcut the rules of the market.
So I want to start talking about the road to the Ukraine invasion and how things sort of started to go wrong in general, to the extent that they were ever right. We often hear about oligarchs. We hear about them buying football clubs or having billions to spend on yachts and, evading sanctions and all these kinds of things. But how did oligarchs actually become oligarchs? How did this come about?
Yeah, interesting question. So it was a combination of things. There was no one factor. I think some of it was personal. There were individuals who were prominent in the Soviet period when they were young, and they had the sort of position, influence, and experience that put them in a privileged position even after the Soviet Union collapsed. They were able to use connections. They were able to take some risk. They had some entrepreneurial spirit. And in many cases, their initial capital that they built their empires on was built on some of the simplest trading activities. Then I think what they did was they were able to parlay that into significant economic and political influence. And all of this was happening in the run-up to Russia's privatization campaign, where former Soviet enterprises were being sold at auction to, allegedly to the highest bidder. But in many cases, these privatization auctions were rigged and fell to essentially insider trading. And then you had really sort of the granddaddy of all oligarch creation, and that was what was known as the loans for shares scheme. And that was sort of, I guess, the culmination of privatization, where some of Russia's, the commanding heights of the Russian economy, some of Russia's biggest enterprises in energy, in mining and minerals, in metals, in steel and coal, what have you, these were significant enterprises that were sort of not quite given, but in an extremely opaque fashion were transferred to a very small number of economic players. That essentially was sort of the birth of the oligarchs.
And so this was the Yeltsin government, but why did the government have an interest in doing that at the time? I mean, it's clear why it's good for the people who get the companies on the cheap and can then make billions, but why would it be good for the government?
Well, it wasn't necessarily good for the government, but it was being told that this was good for the government. Remember that the Yeltsin government, Yeltsin as a president was struggling as a leader, and his popularity rose and fell quite dramatically with the fortunes of the Russian economy. But he was enormously susceptible to outside influence and was surrounded by a group that came to be known as the family, which included blood relatives, included the spouses of blood relatives, and included some business people who exerted enormous influence over Yeltsin. And one of the other things that the loans for shares scheme did was it provided the Yeltsin government with the funds that it needed to stabilize itself. And it also provided the government with money that it needed for the 1996 presidential campaign. And so it was good for the government in the sense that it was good for the Yeltsin presidential campaign of 1996, during which he won re-election. And I guess behind some of this was the concern that if, this happened in 93 and it happened again in 96, the concern that if Yeltsin didn't survive these electoral challenges, that there was a chance that the country would backslide into some sort of Soviet Union 2.0. And so, it was good for the oligarchs, it was good for the Yeltsin administration, and it was deemed, in its own sort of crooked logic, to be good for the country.
So gradually, Putin comes in, and gradually, and sometimes suddenly, Putin expanded his control over the economy. How did that process work? I mean, how did the regime do it? And what are the rules in the system that they've created?
I think we all knew that the Soviet, or rather the Russian security services, are not a farm for liberal Democrats or market economists. But what Putin did, as you say, Marcel, gradually and then suddenly, or sort of with some significant landmarks along the way, was he reinserted the state into the economy. Initially he told the oligarchs, look, you can do business and I'll leave you alone. Make your millions, make your billions. And as long as you stay out of politics, I'll leave you alone. But I think that Putin understood that the creation of economic spheres of power can and often does lead to the creation of political spheres of power. And one of the things that sparked Putin's concern on this was Mikhail Khodorkovsky and his oil company Yukos. And what Putin saw was Khodorkovsky beginning to develop political influence and to exercise that influence in parliament. Yukos was an enormous and powerful Russian energy company. It was in a strategic sector where Putin wanted, the state's interests and the private sector's interests to remain aligned and not to diverge from issues of national security and energy security and foreign policy. And Khodorkovsky was beginning to show a bit of an independent streak. He was influencing parliament, and he also became a sort of international figure in the energy industry. In 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested. And we all know how that ended. He spent 10 years in jail. And, that was a very clear message to the rest of the business world that, if you cross a line that Putin defined, and perhaps only Putin knew exactly where that line was drawn, but if you cross this line, you're going to be in trouble. And increasingly, he sort of turned the screws on private capital and private business people in Russia. There were some significant nationalizations. And so, there was, a reassertion of the state into the economy. The remaining oligarchs, the remaining private giants sort of were put in place really quite sort of concretely. And going forward, there was no deviation allowed from the political line and the political direction that Putin set.
Yeah, you make this fascinating point in the book that really what privatization actually ended up being was very different to what we might imagine it to be. So if you're a German, you're a Brit, you're a Frenchman, you're American, you hear privatization, you think, okay, there's going to be private property, people are going to have rights, there's going to be enforceable contracts. Whereas in reality, the way that the system works now is that the state effectively owns everything. And every now and then there's a bit of a reshuffle as to who gets the spoils from a certain part of the economy. But effectively, there are no protection, that there's no real market economy in the Western sense. And there's also no real private property because everything is at the mercy of the Kremlin.
That's exactly right. And this is something that sort of dawned on the Western business community sort of slowly, because Putin kept on saying early in his term, and he says it now even, while there is a whole new wave of nationalizations of Russian business, but Russian business and Western business in Russia right now. But what he kept on saying was, I'm not going to revisit the 1990s privatization. We're not going to open that can of worms again. But what I think became quite clear, and you're right that a lot of people in the book point to this, is that private enterprise and private capital existed and served at the pleasure of the Kremlin. And, Putin may not care that much about, who's running the flower market in Moscow. But he certainly cares about, the strategic sectors and who's running energy and mining, metals, minerals, telecoms, aviation, certainly any industries that have anything to do with the military sector. Those are companies that exist essentially at his pleasure, individually.
I want to ask a question about Crimea, because obviously when we look at Crimea now and we look at its annexation and the start of Russia's war against Ukraine, what these Western companies did in Russia seems insane. The idea that they would essentially ignore it and stay there seems like a horrendous decision. But again, we have the benefit of hindsight. In the book, what you write is that, it was bad, but not bad enough to really change the minds of most of the people engaged in the Russian economy from abroad. So can you just expand on that a little bit? Like, what was the mood like of the people on the ground and invested in Russia?
Yeah, I think just very quickly before getting into that, one of the things that the book discusses, and one of the things that I learned over my professional career, and certainly while researching the book, is that companies have different appetites for risk. And there are some companies that are quite conservative and quite risk averse. And there are other companies that have quite robust appetites for risk. And I think that those differing appetites for risk were one of the determining factors in how companies digested Crimea. And so what happened was, Russia invaded and then illegally annexed a significant and strategic chunk of a neighboring sovereign nation. And this is a great act of geopolitical violence and hostility. And, the international political world saw it as that, but reacted in a way that was probably failed to appreciate the broader gravity of the situation. Naturally, from the United States and the European Union, you had sanctions on Russia, but they were very narrowly drawn, as sanctions at that time were essentially meant to be. You can only sanction individuals and entities that were associated with the illegal annexation of Crimea. And so it was a fairly narrow package of sanctions, number one. Number two, the actual territory of Crimea did not figure prominently at all in almost anybody's business plans, whether they were doing business in Ukraine or they were doing business in Russia or they were doing business in both countries. Ukraine didn't figure prominently. And so even though this was an incredible act of geopolitical violence, for the business community and for the broader public, who probably wouldn't be able to find Crimea that easily on a map, I don't want to be flippant, but it wasn't that big a deal. Yes, there were a few companies that said, we don't like this. This isn't our cup of tea. We're out of here at the moment of Crimea. But that was a vast minority of companies. And there's this great anecdote in the book from a German businessman who was on the phone with his headquarters office in Berlin, and he's sitting in Moscow, and his colleagues in Berlin are saying, look, what happened with Crimea is just terrible. This is an awful thing. But can you please increase your revenue targets for next year? And I think that, in one sentence describes the Western attitude towards what happened in Crimea, and that is that, yes, it was a horrible thing, but for the business community, the damage, if you will, or the impact was genuinely quite limited. And, again, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, or for those who were, fortuitous enough to sort of see this coming early, we learned that business can coexist with undemocratic or anti-democratic political administrations. And maybe this was one of the examples of that.
And, not just the Germans. You have this other anecdote in the book where you talk about the UK ambassador to Moscow at a time when the UK was imposing sanctions on Russia, inviting rich Russians for dinner and asking them to list on London Stock Exchange and to invest in the UK. So on the one hand, you had these Western governments saying, oh, this is terrible, you can't do this, we're going to impose sanctions. And at the same time, they said, please keep giving us your money. We want to grow closer, which obviously is completely inconsistent.
Yeah, I mean, there are two lessons that come from that anecdote, and you're absolutely right. The British ambassador in Moscow was entertaining prominent Russian business people saying, come list your companies on the London Stock Exchange. And I think two lessons come from this. And the first is that competition has a dramatically distorting, or can have a dramatically distorting impact on the way business people make decisions. And at the time, there was competition between the New York Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange for Russian companies' IPOs. And, the more companies that you could get to list on your exchange, the better it was for your capital market. And so, I think that the British ambassador was sort of reflecting the competition perhaps with the New York Stock Exchange in soliciting Russian businesses and soliciting their business to London. And the second thing that came out of this was generally the role and the position of London in the Russian economy. There was a great book written and a sort of slang word that became widely adopted called Londongrad. And the London professional services sector, including the London Stock Exchange, but the banks and the law firms and the auction houses and the real estate companies and the PR companies were really almost like a second Russian capital for a while. And the penetration of Russian capital into the UK via London was really quite remarkable. And I think that conversation that night over dinner in the British Embassy is reflective of London's almost singular role in working with the Russian economy and developing its wealth.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It also illustrates that yes, we might have had an influence on Russia, but obviously, all that also had an influence on us. I mean, London is extreme, but, there's also an army of lawyers and bankers and PR people and consultants, helping, well, that have helped the Russian regime in Frankfurt and Zurich and New York and all of these other places. And how do we stop that from happening in the future? Because, reading the book, I get the sense that there are a lot of companies that will essentially make money any way they can as long as it's legal. I mean, the companies often talk about their values and their support for democracy and diversity, but fundamentally, a lot of them, I mean, they want to make money. And if it's legal, they're going to do it. That's one of the points that you had in the book, too, where one of the businessmen said, as soon as sanctions are dropped, we're going to be back in. So how do we stop this type of penetration by these dictatorial regimes in our own countries and in our own democracies?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So starting with the legal perspective, I mean, there are already, dozens and dozens of laws in the UK, in the US, in the European Union, in Switzerland. There are, bags, just volumes of law and regulations and, statutes that are meant to keep our economies clean and transparent, and to keep criminal money and sort of dirty money and money laundering, to keep that out of our economic systems. So what do we do? I mean, the one thing is that we have to remember that those laws are theirs and we have to enforce them, because in some cases the laws were bent almost to and sometimes beyond the breaking point. Sometimes they were skirted, sometimes they were ignored. And again, from companies that have significant appetites for risk, it was kind of, shoot first and ask questions later. Let's get this deal done and we'll see what happens. Sorry, that's a little bit cavalier, but it was an attitude close to that sort of attitude. So, and it's the same thing, by the way, with sanctions enforcement. And that is that, there are now thousands of pages of sanctions on the books that are being very poorly enforced. And so at the time that Russian capital was penetrating Western markets, we weren't looking all that carefully at where it was coming from, because you're absolutely right, Marcel, it was developing the economies of Frankfurt and Zurich and London and New York and Geneva and every other major industrial and financial and political capital in the West. And so we were making money, and lots of it. And again, that has a tendency to distort our views on risk. And again, as New York and London competed, or as Zurich and London competed, or as, Frankfurt competed with Stockholm, competing with Oslo, competing with Paris, everyone wanted a slice of that business. And you're right to say that there are plenty of companies that are willing to go back once it becomes legal to do so. There are plenty of Western companies that stayed in Russia. And, what you mentioned in the question, Marcel, this idea of, as long as it's legal, we'll do it. That is essentially the basic threshold that companies use. And then for us to assume beyond the legal threshold, for us to assume that companies will espouse certain values or will behave in certain ways, kind of in the way that we choose our friends. We want to choose friends with similar values and similar moral frameworks. Maybe, some of the lessons that we may have learned from all of this is that we have to change what we expect of companies, and that companies may or may not be moral actors. They are economic actors. To a certain degree, they are political actors. But their guiding principle is, if this business is legal, we will do it. Some companies have additional litmus tests beyond that, but a lot of companies don't. And, it's back to us to say what sort of standard we hold companies to, and whether those standards really are viable anymore.
It's a good point. I think part of the reason why I find it frustrating, or why I have a tough time making peace with it, is because the companies themselves present themselves as moral actors. If they just said, we're here to make money, we're going to do whatever we can to make money, as long as it's legal, it'd be easier to make peace with. But that's not how they present themselves, right? And it just seems a little bit dishonest. But what I take away from it is that we need rules, and we need to actually enforce the rules. And we cannot expect companies to go beyond the things that the legal framework sort of forces them into. right?
Yes, right. I think one of the things that companies learned, actually, and this is all subject to enormous change and evolution right now, and that is that companies learned that when they go beyond the sort of black and white world of the law, when they start talking about moral issues, social issues, and what we called, I think, and maybe even no longer call ESG, companies got very badly burned on a lot of those issues because when they thought they were doing the right thing in one respect, they wound up being judged for it, or they wound up being measured by it. And, when you make one constituency happy, companies learned that they were making other constituencies unhappy, and that they got into a world of gray, and that's a very uncomfortable place for companies to be. And I think that they got burnt on that. And so moving forward, you see companies really sort of saying, look, we don't have an institutional view on these social issues or on these moral issues. We're here to make a product. We're here to sell it at a good price. And we're here to make consumers happy with what they buy, not with what we believe in. And I think that's a part of corporate behavior right now that's under enormous change.
So obviously the book is about Russia, but I think there's a lot to learn more generally. And one of the things, I guess, that struck me is how important it is to take into consideration local interests, not just culture, but just, okay, what do these people want in those countries? Because I guess initially we had this idea that we could just come in, we tell them how to do things, they'd more or less converge with our political and economic model, and things would work out. And one thing that was really striking about it was that you mentioned that oligarchs, for example, might not even have an interest in the rule of law. So we would think, okay, so we've got these rich people, they've got this property now. Clearly, they would have an interest in pushing for the rule of law, even against the government if need be. But your argument is that it might even be the opposite.
That's right. I think what oligarchs learned, and a lot of other business people learned, is that playing by the rules in Russia was sort of costly and often not worth it, because if the political establishment wasn't playing by the rules, which was the case, and by and large the business establishment wasn't playing by the rules, then why bother? There's nothing for us to gain in sticking to the letter of or the spirit of the law in Russia, because nobody was. So influence, whether it was financial or political or economic or otherwise, influence became the name of the game in Russia. And that is, it was better to influence somebody than to sort of cite the statute books to them, number one. Number two, when it came to protecting business interests, the rule of law existed in the places where Russians needed it, and in the places where their legal entities, where sort of the ownership structures were located, and where the money was located, they had the rule of law. They had it in London. They had it in New York. They had it in Geneva and Zurich. They had transparent, reliable legal systems and economic systems in the West. And that's where the roots of a lot of Russian business ultimately were parked. And so, of course, you could count on getting a decent court judgment in London or in Switzerland or anywhere else in the European Union, the UK, the US. And that was where a lot of Russian business was legally domiciled. So who needed it in Russia? You had it where you needed it in the West.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me. That was super interesting. Thanks.
Marcel, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. If you want to stay in touch, like the podcast and subscribe. And if you have feedback or suggestions, leave a comment. I'll see you soon.